was by this afternoon for a little business, if you know what I'm talking about, so...
That's what you're talking about.
That's what I'm talking about, man. Oh, man, I'm fucking wasted.
The story of my professional life is the mycologists loathed me when they realized all I cared about was psilocybin. The scholars say I'm not scholarly enough. The nuts say I'm too straight. The straight people say I'm too nuts. And so it all goes many different ways. One time it was conveyed to me that Marlene Dobkin de Rios said of me, but his scholarship is flawed. And I just roared. It reminded me of the unclear on the concept kind of cartoon. It's not really about that. What there was interest in discussing, and it's only, I mean, perhaps or somewhat marginal to all of this, but fun to talk about, is the magical phlegms that Sparrow mentioned. This is well, here's the background information. They're persistent in the Amazon. Well, as you know, a lot of magic which goes on in the Amazon has to do with the sending of a magical object into the body of an enemy or a person who is made sick. And then the shamans suck these objects out. And invariably, if you're a particularly positivist chucklehead, the question arises for you, is it real? Meaning, you know, can we put it on display in a museum? And then the shamans say yes and no, and sometimes, depending on who you're talking to and probably how much aguardiente they have moving through them at the moment. Persistent is the idea that these ayahuasqueros vomit or produce out of their bodies some kind of substance, a magical substance that is the basis of their witchcraft. And, you know, your attitude toward this can be that it's sleight of hand, or that it's lying, or that it's absolutely true. In my talk yesterday, I said, you know, we give great respect to these shaman. How seriously do we take their claim to do all their magic via helping spirits who are ancestors? And then we sort of explored that. Well, we give these shamans great respect. How seriously then are we obligated, or should we take the claim that they do all of their magic by the production of a magical fluid out of their mouths and bodies, a fluid whose ontological status is far from clear? That's what I mean by you can't tell whether it's real or not. Dennis, in the early, in 1970, came across a reference to this in some piece of literature. I confess that I have occasionally cited it as Michael Harner's article, The Sound of Rushing Water, which appeared in Natural History magazine in 1967. Just to confirm Marlene's opinion, if you actually read that article, you will discover there is no reference to this in there. I couldn't find a reference in the literature until years after our investigation of the phenomenon was pretty much wrapped up. I was amazed to discover that our supposition that such a thing existed actually is supported in the literature. Luis Eduardo Luna, who some of you may know, and most of you probably know his book on ayahuasca painting, has talked about this in numerous of his more scholarly publications. What is claimed is that there are among very unacculturated people a habit, when intoxicated on ayahuasca, of vomiting a material, and then it's said, what's said of it is that it's blue, that the shamans use it to accomplish all their magic, and that when you spread it out on the bottom of a flat bowl, that you can see the future in it, or the past in it. Well, if we just behave like good phenomenologists and don't try to scientifically analyze this, but phenomenologically analyze it, then we have to say what is being described is a form of matter which also partakes of the quality of mind. It appears to be something which is both physical and spiritual, both substantial and psychic or psychological in some sense. And one of our motivations, I told you the story about going to La Chorrera and the search for Ukuhe, but one of our motivations was to investigate this magical material and to see if we could encounter it. Sparrow is the only person I've ever met who claims to have seen something blue come out of someone's mouth on an ayahuasca trip and to be pushed back in. Some of you were there when he made the reference. You saw that I pulled no strings and in fact said nothing to prompt it. So I regard it as uncontaminated information from a deep forest informant. So what is it? Is a reasonable question for curious people to ask. Dennis, who tends these days to rein himself in somewhat, back in the early 70s was always willing to run the speculative engine at double speed, and he felt that he had a concept, and the concept was that it's an interlocking set of hypotheses, none of which have ever been secured, and I have to background it a little bit. As you know, it is a great mystery in neurophysiology, the mystery of memory, and how it works, and where are the memories is a question that has never been answered. The problem for materialists is that it's well understood that every molecule in your body is changed in about a 5 to 9 year period. You are not who you were 10 years ago. Every atom, every molecule in your body has been swapped out with one significant exception, which is the neural substrate, the neural matrix. What you're born with is what you die with. So the memory, if you believe in a physical site of storage, and all scientists do because there is no other medium open for a scientist to believe in, then it must be stored in the neural matrix. Well, so then you try to create a hypothesis of a mechanism for this memory storage and recovery. Now, this raises another complex issue, which is, and I'm moving at lightning speed here, the issue of the nature of information in biological systems. As you all know, organic organisms are created and maintained by DNA. And I assume everybody understands how DNA works. I mean, it's just something you learn in high school biology courses. DNA is a very complex, superhelixed molecule that is essentially two structural members which are twining around each other like a liana, and then they are connected across by nucleotides, and these nucleotides in groups of three are what are called codons, and they code for amino acids. This is, it's an important but subtle distinction, that they code for the amino acids. In other words, there is nothing in principle that links a certain codon in chemistry to a certain amino acid. It is simply a conventionalized association that has apparently come into existence over millions and millions of years of evolution, so that adenine, adenine codes for something, and so forth and so on. In other words, there is a symbolic representation of the amino acids in the codons of DNA. Well, memory is also information, but it's a different kind of information. It's what's called epigenetic information. And if you were to take what I'm saying and about to say to an orthodox molecular biologist, he would very condescendingly explain to you that you had made an amateurish mistake and had confused genetic information, the information which codes for proteins, with epigenetic information, symphonies, novels, works of philosophy, conversations, so forth and so on. And but this same condescending neuromolecular biologist is totally unable to account for the phenomenon of memory. Well, noticing that nature functions always with a certain economy when that's possible, it seems like a reasonable first hypothesis would be that memory is coded somehow into the DNA. And giving a slight aid and comfort to this idea is the well-known fact that there are vast portions of the DNA molecule that are called the nonsense portions. In other words, they do not code for protein. No one knows what these vast stretches of DNA are for, and the orthodox explanation is that they are just errors, trash, basically, that has accumulated in the evolutionary process. Nevertheless, the mystery of memory is left unexplained. How are the memory traces laid down, and how are they recalled? Well, Dennis's notion in trying to think about what the psychedelic experience is was that perhaps psychedelic molecules have a relationship to the DNA that has not been elucidated by science. And in his favor is the fact that many of these psychedelic molecules, especially the ones most near and dear to us, such as psilocybin, harmine, harmaline, DMT, are what are called planar molecules. In other words, if we could explode a molecule of harmine up to the size of a bathtub, what we would have is a flat structure. The two benzene rings associated with the pentexyl group in the middle, and it is of the correct dimension, coincidentally enough, that a harmine molecule could in fact fit into a DNA molecule between the nucleotide pairs without disrupting the structure of the DNA. This is a studied phenomenon. Molecules which, the word is intercalate, molecules which can slip in between the DNA pairs, the nucleotide pairs, are called intercalators or dimers. And most of them are highly toxic because in the process of slipping in there, they distort the helical structure of the molecule. In other words, they kink it up. A molecule that some of us have experience with that I believe works this way is chloroquine. Chloroquine, this is why I say, it's a heavy drug. It messes with your genetic machinery. It's actually getting in there. And usually these molecules are used in vitro work with DNA because they can be used as markers. You can take a radioactive dimer and it will intercalate into DNA, and then you can perform certain operations and measurements. But it was shown in, I believe, 1966 by the chemists Yielding and Sturglantz that psychedelic molecules do intercalate into DNA in vitro, in the test tube, in a series of very elegant experiments in which what they did is they took denatured DNA, unfolded from its superstructure, but still helix DNA, and they put it in test tubes with various drug molecules, and they shook it up, and then they measured the specific gravity of the molecular complex that resulted, and they showed that the specific gravity had increased by a number which was always divisible by the molecular weight of the drug molecule. This is pretty elegant demonstration that the drug molecule has in fact intercalated into the DNA. Now, against this, at that time, we're talking now the early 70s, was a near dogma of neurophysiology, which said movement of materials in the neuron, which is what a nerve cell is called, movement of materials in the neuron is from the nucleus to the synapse. You all recall that the synapse is where these drug molecules do their work because there are lock and key relationships, and they shift the, it's not known, either the steric configuration or the electrical activity of the synapse. And so when we would talk to orthodox molecular biologists about this, they would say, well, there is no known mechanism of transport from the synapse to the neuron, to the nucleus of the neuron. And if you're hypothesizing that memory is somehow stored in the DNA, then somehow experiences which affect the synapse have to, there has to be some conveyance of this change of state at the synaptic cleft back to the nucleus in the neuron. And these nerve cells are very elongated structures. The axon can be several millimeters in length. In some cases, like in the squid axon, it's quite large, over a centimeter, I think. Anyway, now giving aid and comfort to our side is the fact that in the early 80s, 10 years after the experiment at La Chorrera, a new intracellular process was discovered called axioplasmic transport. And it was discovered that in fact molecular species generated in the synaptic cleft do turn up associated with the nucleus of the molecule of the neuron. So, this all lays the basis for his notion, which was that somehow psychedelic molecules, which normally operate in the synaptic cleft, can be conveyed into the nucleus of the neuron and there intercalate, and somehow this is the basis for a mechanism of modifying the silent portions of the DNA and information, not of the genetic sort, but of a transient and epigenetic sort, because your memories die with you, although Jungians might take issue here, but let's leave that issue alone for a minute. Your memories die with you, so there was a mechanism for this to happen. So, I'm not sure. Well, give me a moment here. So one of the things that we were investigating when we went to La Chorrera, Dennis believed that the importance of chanting in this Amazonian shamanism was that acoustical sound was being used as a driver to synergize this process of intercalation. And it has been demonstrated in the laboratory that you can use acoustical energy to cause the intercalation of dimers into DNA. So shortly after we arrived at La Chorrera, he created a very elaborate theory, which is described in excruciating detail in The Invisible Landscape, which is a very hard book to obtain, but it will be reprinted in 1994 by Harper. He constructed a very elegant experiment, which looks like part science, part magic, and the idea was that you would load your system with psychedelic molecules, and he believed that electron spin resonance, here's the connection, that electron spin resonance alteration of the DNA molecule was that there was some kind of transduction system in the cell that raised that electron spin resonance signal to the level of the higher cortical experience, which we call thought. In other words, that what thinking is our interpretation of very rapid microfine changes in the electron spin resonance of DNA molecules in the nucleus of neurons. And since there is no counter theory on the table, nobody knows what thought is. I mean, neurologists aren't even ready to begin to discuss that. His theory seemed reasonable to at least play with for a while. And he said that we could load our systems with biodynamic tryptamines, harmaline, harmine, beta-carbolines, and that if you could generate a tone that was precisely the analog of the electron spin resonance of the molecule, and if you could get the geometry of the angle of attack of the sound, basically, on the molecule, exactly precise, that you could force the molecule, the drug molecule, into the DNA, and that it would shift the electron spin resonance of the DNA, and that it would permanently bond in there. Now, this seems to me at least worth exploring. Harmine is, if you look at it, it looks like an antenna. You know, it has the five-sided central structure and then the two benzene rings. It has charge transfer running around those rings. It's very architecturally suited to perform the function of a kind of a transmitter antenna. So imagine what we're doing here is we're dropping a harmine molecule down onto the DNA, which is itself giving off what is called a hyperfine ESR signature. And the harmine is amplifying that hyperfine signal, and this is being detected as a higher cortical experience, which we call the psychedelic experience. And that then what the psychedelic experience is assumed to be in this interpretation is it is the sum total of all information garnered by the species over time and stored in the silent portions of the DNA. Do you see? So what we're talking about here is a kind of mechanical, materialist, chemical approach to the amplification of the hidden portions of the DNA. And it is true that many people taking harmine in its pure form and taking ayahuasca report a hum. It's a characteristic of the intoxication. Dennis claimed that this was actually the electron spin resonance signal of the harmine. So when we got to La Chorrera, and under the inspiration of recklessly large doses of Stropharia cubensis, which we found growing in the pasture there, he decided that what we could do was we would take a trip, but that he would attempt to imitate the harmine hum, and that, granted, you know, the human body is a very gross thing in comparison to the almost quantum chemical domain of the synapse and the nucleus, but that nevertheless, if you could generate the sound correctly, you would force the molecule into the neuron, and then there was another part of the theory which had to do with the idea that these psychedelic molecules are like octaves of each other. And if any of you have ever played the cello, you know that you can sound a note on the cello, and then if you still the string, you will hear what are called overtonal harmonics. It will sound in the octave above and below the octave in which the note was struck. And he felt that if again, here, I mean, I'm giving this to you at enormous speed. Superconductivity, which is normally associated with low temperatures, is in fact a low temperature phenomenon, but that's when you have populations of trillions of molecules. Really what superconductivity means is the stilling of molecular motion. And if it's absurd to speak of a single atom or a single molecule as being 275 degrees Kelvin below zero, because temperature is a phenomenon of mass populations of molecules. But he felt that you could essentially still these molecules, and one of the peculiar qualities of superconductive molecules is that they will bond to anything. They have a tremendous stickiness about them. So he thought that the human voice could be used to cancel the molecular motion of these harmine molecules, and you would only have to do it for a millisecond, even though the making of the tone might take 20 or 30 seconds. If you achieved the correct geometry, the correct tonality, the correct situation, for just a millisecond, the molecule would drop, the drug molecule would drop into superconducting configuration, it would intercalate, and it would bond permanently into the thing, into the neural DNA. And then it would begin broadcasting this amplified and expanded electron spin resonance. And that what this would be, he thought, was well, he felt that it would generate like an acoustical hologram of the contents of the DNA. And he thought that this is what the magical blue phlegm is. Its peculiar ontological status of being part matter, part psyche, arises from the fact that it is an acoustical hologram generated out of the body. It's like ectoplasm or something. It's a wavering image of the sum total of the information within the DNA. It's sort of like trying to produce a television set without a television, the experience of television without a television set. Well, I thought that all of this sounded so wacky, and that there were so many untested assumptions and hypotheses linked together in this tinker toy structure. And since we had nothing better to do in the evenings, why not, was my attitude. So the experiment was performed, and Dennis went bananas for about 3 weeks, and we had all kinds of peculiar adventures. But one of the things that happened was that I, who had been the utter skeptic, if not the contemptuous skeptic of this, noticed that immediately after the experiment, I began to have funny ideas. And it was as though he just turned a switch. And what he had said would happen was that he would generate out of his body a glowing blue disc, which would be the holding mode of this. We called this process hypercarbylation. Why? I haven't the faintest idea at this distance. But the idea was essentially that you could cause your soul to become visible and to become stabilized in three-dimensional space, that it was like a tool, that you could give birth to a thing which was an artifact, and yet at the same time it was yourself. And that what human evolution and human history was pushing forward was the generation of, hey, let's be frank, the philosopher's stone out of the human body. You could, through a union of harmine and mind and psilocybin and intentionality, you could produce a kind of doppelganger, which would not look like a human being. It would look in its holding mode like this glowing blue disc. But because it is both mind and matter, it would have, the way he thought of it was as a hyperdimensional molecule. In other words, yesterday Jonathan talked about dextro and rotary rotation of molecules, that you can rotate them to the right and to the left. Well, yes, in 3 dimensions, but we know that the universe is, some people think, 11-dimensional. So beyond dextro and levo rotation, there is also hyperdimensional rotation, or hypercarbylation. And he thought that once you did this, the continued existence of your physical body would become optional, and you would be able to operate as this thing which is essentially the imagination bound into 3-dimensional space. And he thought that these shamans producing this phlegm, that they were on the brink of something like this. Now, I grant you that this is far-fetched. If you think I don't think it's far-fetched, you don't understand where I'm coming from. But the idea was so incredibly beguiling and attractive, because what he said was, if you have this, if you can produce this ultimate tool, then you can do anything. I mean, if you want to take a shower on it, you just stretch it out and water pours out of it. If you want to go somewhere, you turn it over and sit on it and it flies. If you're hungry, you eat it. Do you get the idea? So I said, you can't be serious, Dr. McKenna, although he wasn't a doctor at the time. So this experiment was performed. He began to behave very peculiarly, and I began to have these funny ideas. And one thing which did happen, which I offer as evidence for the manipulation of some very, very peculiar effect out on the edge of intelligibility, was I didn't sleep for 11 days. And he had said this would happen. He said, you will no longer need to sleep, you will no longer excrete, you will no longer eat, because your body has become superconductive. And you are essentially, you have sealed yourself off. You have become the stuff of soul. You are no longer embedded in the world of metabolism. And what also and he had the idea that the thing would occur instantly. This blue disc would appear instantly. And of course, when the experiment was performed, nothing of the sort happened. But instead, what I began to generate were what I call, from my experience with Jungian psychology, totality symbols. A totality symbol is an idea which explains everything. It can be as simple as the syllable Om, or a mandala, or a mathematical description of reality. I mean, some totality symbols are obviously more appropriate, more effective than others. And kind of a psychotic episode, but it was a very curious psychotic episode because it took the form of being spread out through the whole universe, and then over a period of 21 days imploding backward into yourself, so that like the first day after the experiment, he was just incomprehensibly bizarre, just universally. I mean, it was like witnessing someone acting out the Big Bang or something like that. Then the next day, he was condensed down into the local cluster. And we got a recitation somewhat like Olaf Stapleton's The Star Maker. Then the next day, and he said the lens-like shape of galaxies is a macro-physical reflection of this thing which we were trying to create, which he called the lens. And so by a series of telescoping leaps, he made his way toward normality, condensing down through the galaxy to the solar system, spending a day on each planet as he made his way toward the Earth, becoming all the life on the Earth, then becoming all human life, then becoming all Irish life, then becoming our entire family, doing perfect voice imitations of all the relatives and revealing all this knowledge of, skeletons in the closet and suppressed stuff, and stuff that I don't know how he knew all this stuff. I mean, he at times appeared to work miracles. At one point, I was trying to test him and his abilities, and I recalled that there was a box that my grandfather had given me that you opened with a little silver key that had been lost for years and years. And I said, well, if you can do anything, why don't you produce the key that to that box, which neither of us had seen even the box for a dozen years. By this time, he was naked and locked in a room at the mission. And he went and he would make these bizarre gestures, these strange I don't know what was going on. And he went into a period of concentration, gave a wild squawk, and slammed into my hand and gave me the key. Gave me the key. He was naked. He had been locked in this room for 14 days at that time. And I was like, I didn't know what was going on. But what was happening to me was I was like utterly unconcerned for his mental health or any practical concern, which was causing a lot of problems for the other people on the expedition. In classical psychology, this is called a folie à deux, a delusion of two. It's a simultaneous schizophrenic episode. It usually involves a mother and a daughter. I've never heard of a brother-brother folie à deux. But it was accompanied by all these exterior manifestations, freak rainbows, and in my case, an encounter with a UFO. And this UFO encounter had a very curious quality to it. Not that they don't always, I suppose. But this was even more curious than the pedestrian UFO encounter. What happened was it was on the 13th day of the reversal, and I had this intimation. There was something going on about the Southwest. I wasn't clear quite what it was, and the two women on the expedition were that afternoon washing our clothes down by the Choro, by the lake, and I looked across the lake and I saw in the sky not a rainbow but just a spot in the sky that was a spectrogrammatic diffraction, you know, a little patch of rainbow. And I asked the women if they saw it, and they said they didn't. And then it intensified. And by this time, I was plenty in the doghouse as well. I mean, this put a great deal of strain on our small party, as you can imagine. And this spectrogrammatic iridule intensified. And then I said to them, "Now do you see it?" And they looked and they said, "Oh, yeah, it's, you know, big deal, not much." But I knew. And knowing means the voice was speaking to me. All kinds of weird things went on. I mean, I discovered that the closer I was to water, the easier it was for me to rhyme, which I've never. And then years later, I encountered a Celtic saying: "Poetry is made at the edge of running water," and the thing would give me these aphorisms. Like one time it said, "The clone's load is a stoned mode." And, you know, and I was not sleeping. I was now 11 days without sleep. So that night I decided to sit by the Choro, and just because I stayed up all night, and I would walk in the fields, and the thing would would connect up the constellations for me and show me where they were in the sky. There was also embedded in all this thing the intimation of this thing called the teacher, which was a giant insect-like thing that was always like right over here. And there was the sense of something watching us from the sky, something moving us very, very gently but persistently toward this very weird breakthrough. So I sat there all night long on the laundry stone at the Choro, and about dawn, around dawn, I looked out across the lake and to the jungle, and about a mile away over the jungle there was a low bank of clouds. And as I watched these clouds, I noticed that they seemed to be rolling in place. was like scrolling, like the roller on a typewriter or something. And as I watched, they divided into 4 perfectly shaped, lens-shaped cloudlets. And as I watched the 4, they coalesced into 2. And then as I kept watching, the 2 coalesced into 1. And at that moment, I heard the whee, whee, whee sound that flying saucers make in Hollywood B movies, you know? And I looked back over my shoulder, thinking of the people in the hut behind me, about 70 feet up the bank, thinking, I have to get a witness. I was driven nuts by this idea of the witness, because everybody's interpretation was that we had just gone bonkers, completely bonkers. So I thought, I have to get the witness. And I assessed the possibility and looked back across the lake, and the thing was coming toward me. It was coming straight for me. And I felt, even for me, this was some kind of a moment of truth, where then I realized, my God, it's actually real. We are going to get the lens. We are going to break through to the machinery of the millennium. And I felt my knees go out on me, and I just like sat back down, and the thing, I could see it, and getting closer and closer and clearer, and then it passed over above me, and in the last moment before it was lost by the hill of the bluff of the Choro, I could see it was turning slowly. It had blue and orange lights. I could see the rivets on the underside. I could see the 3 half spheres on the underside. And having spent at one point, having been interested in UFOs, I immediately recognized it as the end cap of a 1937 Hoover vacuum cleaner. The very Hoover vacuum cleaner that the charlatan George Adamski had suspended by a fish line in his garage in Southern California in 1948 and photographed and released as a picture of a UFO, which was then totally debunked. So here I am seeing a 50-foot version of a Hoover vacuum cleaner end cap slicing across the sky. And psychologists have a term, cognitive dissonance. This is when things get so out of control that you don't know shit from shinola, is what cognitive dissonance is. So it was more shocking to me than an extraterrestrial spacecraft would have been, because it was showing me that what I was looking at couldn't possibly be a flying saucer. It was rather something so preposterous and absurd that if I were to tell this to anyone, for sure they would drop nets over me. And so, you know, that was the UFO. And then the next morning, we actually flew out of La Chorrera. Dennis normalized about 4 days later to his present normal state. I, on the other hand, have never come down, and time wave 0, which I can't explain it if you don't know what it is, but it is the actual fruit of this experience, and time wave 0 is the thing promised. It's a map of all space and time, and it predicts the location of the lens, December 22nd, 2012, and it's as though what he thought would take a moment at La Chorrera at dawn on the morning of the 4th of March, 1971, is actually stretched out over, 45 years? But in a sense, we're locked inside that moment, I mean, something very, very, very extraordinary and peculiar went on. One of the things that happened was I was just absolutely ecstatic this whole time. I mean, I was abiding in the Buddha realm. I was complete, and I assumed we would never leave La Chorrera. I couldn't imagine why we would. And I remember, well, here's an example of the kind of stuff that would go on. One afternoon, I walked out of the little sandy place where the hut was, where Dennis was being confined, and after a while, he was taken out of my quote-unquote care by more sober members of the expedition, and I was just basically abandoned in the woods because I refused to come into the mission, and I just lived in the woods. And this one incident, I was there, and I would go out and I would raise my hands, and the butterflies, I could call them in. I could call in hundreds of butterflies, and so I would be there like this, and the butterflies would come and they would settle on my arms and my shoulders in front of me, and I had a lot of guilt about what I'd been doing in Indonesia the previous 2 years, which was slaughtering butterflies. And so, like, tears of joy and ecstasy I just would completely emotionally come apart, weep, and then stop weeping and think about how I have to have a witness. I have to have a witness. So then I would go and get my major skeptic, who was this colleague of mine, a woman from Berkeley, who, thought, as any reasonable person would, that I was completely bananas. So I would, without telling her what would happen, I led her out into the forest, and then I stood there with upraised arms, waiting for the butterflies. And of course, no butterflies would come near me. And it was just like, said, my God, you have lost it. You are mad. What are we going to do? And this was going on hundreds of miles in the jungle. I mean, there was no way out. We had been led into this place, and then this thing had been laid on us. At another incident, similar deal, was we had this little pot, this little enameled pot, which we cooked our avena in, our oatmeal, every morning. And the biggest bummer in the camp chores was cleaning the burnt avena out of the bottom of the pot. And there was this spring a few hundred yards from where all this was going on, where we washed our dishes. And you would go down to the spring and pick up sand out of the bottom of the spring, and then by furiously scrubbing, you could get the avena out of the pot, the burnt avena. So one day it was my turn to do this, and I went down by myself, and I put the pot in water, and I was hearing the voice all the time, and it would say things to me like, if it isn't simple, you haven't thought about it enough. And really weird things, like when I would sit and talk as I'm talking now, my hands would unconsciously lay fires. It was just like, what was happening was that consciousness or gnosis or something was coming out of my pores practically. Everything taught. That's what I said. I said, everything teaches. You want to understand chemistry? Look in a mud puddle on the trail. Just sit down and look in it. All you need to know is here. You want to understand botany? Just hold a plant in your hand. And I was, and I pestered people all the time. People said, just back it off, man. So I took the avena pot down to the spring, and the thing said, if it isn't simple, you haven't thought about it enough. So what I did is I put about a half-inch of water in the bottom of the pot, and then I picked up a handful of sand, and like putting salt on your eggs, I sifted it down, And then I took the pot and I went like this, and then I poured it out, and all the black crud and everything just poured out and was swept away. And again, I wept. I did a lot of weeping. I was, I don't know. And so then the next morning, it was my turn to cook breakfast. And so I deliberately burned the avena. And then after breakfast, I said to Sal, to my most fierce critic present, I said, let's wash the pot together. So we went down to the spring, and she was getting ready to do and I said, wait a minute, let me show you something. And I did the thing, and I, just like this. And she said, my God, what's the matter with you? Well, actually, it took 10 years before she and I returned to speaking terms. And she is now a psychoanalyst, not a psychotherapist, not your hands-on touchy-feely power animal, but, the real thing, the medical degree, the whole bit. She's now a psychoanalyst in Berkeley. And we still actually avoid, we've never had the conversation I want to have, because I know she thinks I'm okay now. And the fact is, I've never found any reason to retreat from any of this. I don't know what it was about. I just know that, and I'm still riding on that trip. I never really came down. And it's somewhat, it's sort of hard to talk about, but obviously not that hard to talk about. But I actually do believe that I have superconducting harmine in my DNA, and that in a sense this weird role that has been laid on to me and my linguistic facility or whatever it is the thing speaking, and it's controlling at least my life, and I don't know how much of the rest of reality. The proof of all this now rests on time wave zero, which we got this bugger beat down into a mathematical equation. The discovery of the nature of temporality and the way in which reality is put together out of a temporal hologram, a fractal of some sort, and yet, the absurdity has not been exercised, because time wave zero makes the preposterous assumption that the world will transform itself beyond recognition on the morning of December 22nd, 2012. And as I say, I can't explain it to you here, but it's fairly elegant, and it uses all of human history, all of biological evolution, all of geological history to make the point that we are being sucked toward a kind of black hole of concrescence that is what's causing human history. And when I asked the thing, as any reasonable person would, why us? Why us? It had a very simple and straightforward answer, which was because you don't believe in anything. Because you don't believe in anything. And then the other part of it was, and I was reminded of this by what Jonathan said the other day, that chance favors the prepared mind. Did I get it right this time? Because the other thing it said was, it had something to do with the mushroom, and it said, we've never met anyone, and by we, it meant the clone in the pasture at La Chorrera, because this was some kind of isolated Stropharia clone. It was hundreds and hundreds of miles to the next pasture. But in this pasture at La Chorrera, this strain, which was later released into the American population as AMZ, was there. And it said, we've never met anybody before who had the I Ching in their head. It was like, this we can work with. We can take this piece of information, this primitive Chinese oracle, and it is sufficient to our needs to create a context for communicating what we want to communicate. And what we want to communicate is the hyperdimensional nature of reality. Time is not what you think it is. And we can use the I Ching to build a model that your primitive hominid mind can actually wrap itself around, and you can then, and then we can have the basis for a dialogue. So, I don't know, you can take this many ways. You can take it as a cautionary tale about psychotropic involvement, or I don't know. Questions?
Why you did not sleep for 12 days before this happened?
No, it was after it happened.
After it happened?
Yes. See, the experiment was on the morning of March 5th, 1971. And then I didn't sleep for those 12 days. And Dennis was really, he'd had it. After he came down, which was on the really officially on the 21st of March, which was St. Joseph's Day, which seemed terribly significant at the time, because our father's name was Joseph. And the priest at La Chorrera was Jose Maria. And there was all this kind of thing. I think it's called delusion of reference. It's where everything is about you. Everything is a unique and special symbology directed toward you. And it's a wonderful state to be in. It's just that you're tremendously obnoxious. And because other people are sort of devalued in the aura of that thing because it isn't referencing to them. I've heard of people not sleeping for long periods of time, but not sleeping effortlessly and enjoying every moment of it. I would walk the trails at night, barefoot, and occasionally at my whim naked, there in the center of the Amazon, just the learning from the stars, looking in flowers, listening to birds, holding objects in my hand, and just, and the other members of the expedition thought I was terribly callous because I wasn't concerned about Dennis. And Dennis, he made his way through it. Much of it was absurd. Much of it was highly absurd. I mean, there was at La Chorrera, down by the river house where he was eventually incarcerated and where everybody was staying, this cock and hen. And they were always around, and we always noticed them, and they did seem to be unusually alert and involved in things. And on the same day he produced the silver key, he announced that this cock and hen were actually James and Nora Joyce, and that somehow James Joyce, by having been able to write Finnegan's Wake, had at death been put in charge of at least La Chorrera. And the funny thing about La Chorrera was that the river made a bend there that was in fact analogous to the bend in the river Liffey at Dublin that is the basis for Finnegan's Wake, because the belief, the magical geography built into Finnegan's Wake is it's a giant man lying there beside the river Liffey, who is his consort, and it's the cosmic pair. And so Dennis said, well, so now they're in charge of La Chorrera. Everything was made out of puns. Puns and puns and puns and puns. Tons of puns. And you just, you didn't know whether to laugh or cry or claw the air or what to do exactly. And since then, and then we wrote The Invisible Landscape, which was published in 1975. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's our effort to make this rationally apprehendable to people. And there are probably, if you went through and numbered the unproven assertions, they must number in the dozens, if not hundreds. And no, not one has ever been, to my satisfaction, overthrown. Axioplasmic transport, it's now dogma. Then it was heresy. Importance of electron spin resonance, room temperature superconductivity, it was absolutely anathema in 1971. Now millions of dollars are being spent to produce room temperature superconductors, and on and on and on. It was a very unusual experience. I mean, basically into about 20 days was packed enough weirdness that the rest of our lives have been spent living in the shadow of this thing. And one of the things, for instance, that it said was, it said, you will be given a technique. It will change your lives beyond recognition. It will appear magical, but no laws of physics will be broken. Well, I thought I had this weird image. Why? I mean, these things would just pop into my mind. I had this weird image of being able to put my hands like this around a flower and sing it into bloom. But now I understand that what the technique was the cultivation of Stropharia cubensis. And that, it violates no laws, it's trivial, it's just hard work. And yet, it brought the AMZ strain into the American hallucinogen scene. And I think, that it's like a viral infection from hyperspace or something, that everybody who gets into this joins the plot, whether they realize it or not, and that all our lives are woven together in something which is like a mega novel, a recherche du temps perdu times 10 kind of operation, and we shall see. I keep expecting the curve of expectations generated at La Chorrera to eventually meet the curve of reality, and for everything to calm down and for everything to be disproven and go away. At the time this happened, Dennis's most advanced degree was in religious studies, and my most advanced degree was and remains hashish smuggling. Now he is a molecular biologist and a pharmacologist and a this and a that. And, we're taken far more seriously than we deserve unless supernatural agencies are at work, I would think. So, and of course, the acid test is December 22nd, 2012. If nothing whatsoever happens, well, I've promised many an audience, having turned 65 a month before, I'll just simply retire and try to bow out as gracefully as possible. And
just remember, there was a Korean church that had been busted recently because their devotees sold all their real estate and all that and gave up. They were waiting for the final day.
oh, well, not only do I know all about that, but my theory can explain why it happened. Well, it's simply that this event in 2012, think of it as the, those mirrored balls that they hang in discos that rotate and send off reflections? The transcendental event at the end of history sends distorted reflections of itself ricocheting backward through time. And a Christ, a Buddha, a John Smith, a Charles Manson, an Adolf Hitler, these are people who were hit by a distorted ricochet of the truth at the end of time. And they act out their distorted understanding. And I assume my understanding as well is distorted. But what we're trying to do here is create an approximation of the real thing. It won't be understood until the final hours of the concrescence, because the transcendental event at the end of human history is actually below the event horizon of the future. We can't see that far into the future, but time wave zero is the map, and the argument for its validity is its application to the past, and anyone, skeptic or believer, can look at its application to the past. It predicts the asteroid fall which killed the dinosaurs. It predicts the fall of the Berlin Wall. It predicts I would argue it's never been wrong about the past. So why should we doubt what it says about the future? And yet what it says about the future is confounding, because it says that we are within 20 years of the absolutely unimaginable conclusion of process in three-dimensional space and time. And that what we are involved in is not the redemption of our species or a crisis in the ecosystem of our planet, but that what we are involved in is something much, much larger than these things. What we're involved in is a crisis in the laws of physics themselves. And I can take an idea like that, I think, and make it reasonable. And here's how I would do it. Because here's the way the argument against it goes. People say, well, my dear fellow, don't you think it's a little odd that this culminating event of human history, the culminating event of 6 billion years of process, is going to occur in the 0.00001% of time that contains your lifetime? What are the odds of that? Well, the answer is the presence of thinking human beings on this planet, the presence of technologies, the presence of ourselves is part of the concrescence. In other words, we are the indicator species for the nearby presence of the transcendental object. If this planet only held muskrats, toucans, and amoebas, no problem. But our appetite for history and for technology means we are being drawn toward something unimaginable which is shaping us to its agenda. And this is why history is so hard to understand, because, for God's sake, we're monkeys. And yet we have been drawn into the production of art, moral values, social organization, so forth and so on. And I think that in the same way that a still pond begins to churn before an enormous form breaks the surface, human history is the churning on the surface of the still pond of nature. And it announces that we are historical milliseconds away from the confrontation with this unimaginable concrescent conclusion. I know that that sounds highly unlikely, but before you dismiss it entirely, let's take a look at what the competition is pushing. The competition, meaning science, says that the universe sprang from a point smaller than a gnat's eyelash in a single moment for no reason. Well, now, whatever you think about that theory, please notice that it's the limit case for credulity. In other words, if you can believe that, what the hell can't you believe? That is the most unlikely thing that anyone could ever dream up. In principle, it's the most unlikely and improbable thing anybody could dream up. And that's what science is about. They say, give us one free miracle, and no problem. We can explain from there. Just one, picosecond of miracle, and then we have no problem explaining what happened after that. Well, same deal here. I'm just saying, instead of the Big Bang billions of years ago, how about a cosmology which I call the Big Surprise? And instead of making human beings like ourselves peripheral, on a nothing planet in a nothing galaxy at the edge of a nothing cluster in a, that's the science bit. Why not imagine that we are at the center of the cosmic drama, and that we somehow carry with us the responsibility both to observe, to midwife, and to participate in the birthing of a new order of being. I don't believe, and it seems to me irrational to believe, that human history can be supposed to continue thousands and thousands of years into the future. It's not possible. That, to me, is an irrational scenario. How could that be? It cannot be. We can see the finite limits coming at us at light speed right now. It's almost over. And we close our minds to it because the only over that we can conceive of is the yawning grave. But how about a different version of over? How about a transubstantiant apotheosis that leads to concrescent immersion in the unspeakable mystery that is the strange attractor at the end of the process of becoming throughout all space and time? I just find it a more psychedelic and a more pleasing and a more fun way of thinking about reality. And after all, fun, I think, is probably the name of the game. If you're not having fun with your ideological constructs, then what the hell are you doing with them? Questions?
But this new cosmology that you just stated of a new rebirthing seems the same as the science perspective of the cosmology of everything coming from one point. Because for me, if in fact, and I resonate with that, we all came from one point. If we in fact came from one point, then we are all interconnected in that one point. And in doing so throughout these thousands and thousands and millions of years, we are now able to rebirth a new being, a new enterprise.
Well, doesn't it seem likely that if we all came from one point, then we're all destined to return to one point? The only thing that I think makes this a hard swallow is this insistence, driven, as I like to say of those I criticize, driven by the fiat of a fishy formula, that it's 20 years away. If I told you it was 2 billion years away, probably you could rock and roll with that. But 20 years is just too mind-boggling to conceive of.
We've come a long way, baby.
Well, we've come a long way, yes. As the mushroom said to me, the earth is old.
You're quoted by Robert Anton Wilson, although I've never heard it from you, citing as parallel to this event the sense of the doubling over of knowledge from 0 to 1620, from 1620 to 1800, that by the date that you're citing, knowledge would be doubling over every nanosecond. Is that something you were...
It's put through the filter of his understanding, but yes.
And also the Mayan calendar. And
Well, my notion, and I give workshops on time wave zero, and it's utterly inappropriate here, and we need computers and so forth and so on, but it is my best trick. I have to tell you, it is my best trick. But the way it works is it has a series of collapses built into it. So you have a very long cycle of time, and then you have a cycle of time which is 1/64th as long, and it recapitulates in a compressed form the themes of the larger cycle. And then it has built into it a cycle 1/64th its size. Well, in a universe that was constructed like that, you would go from a cycle of 175,000 years, or roughly, to a cycle of 4,306 years, to a cycle of 67 years. And I believe that the last 67-year cycle occurred beginning August the 5th, 1945. And that from August the 5th, 1945 until December 22nd, that's the Hiroshima date, from that date to December 22nd, 2012, all the themes of the previous 4,306 years is recapitulated in a kind of compressed form, and that we can actually analyze what's going on in the world by looking at the resonances in the larger cycle. So, for instance, right now we've reached the early 8th century. The reason things are so fucked up is because we're in resonance with the Dark Ages, for God's sake. And we won't reach, pick a something or other. We won't reach Newton until 2005 or something like that. And in a cosmology like that, where the collapse factor is 64, a universe built like that would undergo half of its becoming in the last 135 minutes of its existence. This is why I call it the big surprise. 384 days before December 22nd, 2012, we will enter into a yet more dense domain of novelty. And then 6 days before December 22nd, 2012, a yet more condensed domain of novelty. But in the last hour and 35 minutes, we will go through like 12 of these collapses. This is why the thing cannot be known. In a sense, I'm saying that the entire history of the universe is that time is speeding up so rapidly that the entire future history of the universe is going to be jammed into the next 20 years most of it in the last hour and 35 minutes of those 20 years.
And then what?
Understanding. Asking that question is like being a medieval peasant in the 9th century asking about the space shuttle, virtual reality, and, the second Clinton administration. It is literally, in principle, unknowable to us at this time. What Time Wave Zero gives you is a map of the ebb and flow of novelty that you can use to confirm for yourself that the process I'm describing is actually underway, on track, and describable. Time for one more question, yes?
Have you written something about Time Wave Zero?
Well,
what is it?
It's in the last half of The Invisible Landscape is about this, and also we've produced computer software about it that runs in both the Mac and MS-DOS environment, and it comes with a 60-page manual. All the mathematics are there. The mathematics are very elegant, and the strongest argument to me personally that this is all very, very weird is that I am not a mathematician. I can't balance my checkbook. And yet I have produced a mathematical theory, a fractal mathematical theory, 10 years before the word fractal gained any currency. And mathematicians of great reputation have been over this and over it. And they say, they don't make a judgment on what it's saying about history, but that they say as a mathematical notion, it has tremendous beauty, elegance, cohesion. There's nothing wrong with it. The reason I could produce this thing, nobody could dream up Time Wave Zero. You would have to be told, like I was told. I was told by the mushroom, essentially, under the aegis of Dennis's superconducting amplification of the message within it. And I think everyone who takes high-dose mushroom trips gets snapshots of the future history, or that there is some great event coming, and so forth and so on. What makes our experience different is that we were able to lock it in for months and to carry on the dialogue, not for 4 hours, but for 71, 81, 81, 91. For 22 years, I've been discussing this with the Logos. And when I make a mistake, it gently corrects my hand. And so then, to call this a channeling or something weird like that, it's the weirdest channeling ever to come down the pike. It's a mathematical equation. It's in the same ballpark as, Clerk Maxwell's descriptions of the electromagnetic field or Einstein's descriptions of the curvature of space. And yet I failed Algebra 2. And, who knows? Perhaps it's just an exotic, psychotic episode, and I should be, exhibited at various conventions of those who treat these more anomalous. It's a delusion of such power and of such elegance that it may be the truth, and time will tell.
Terence, why don't you do another experiment of the superconductivity?
Because all that rests in Dennis's hands, and he says absolutely no, because he went bananas. He paid the price.
You can't do it by yourself.
No, I can't understand it. I can understand my part of it, but you have no idea what he became. He became, as he said of the brothers McKenna, we're not no univac, nor no maniac. We're the brothers Rezeniak. I'm still waiting to meet the brothers Rezeniak. If any of you know them, have them give me a call. I feel very indulged by you, I must say, to listen to this. I don't do this I don't tell the story of La Chirera. In April, a book will be published called True Hallucinations that tells the story like a novel with all the crazy incidences and everybody's point of view and the various evidentiary exhibits and so forth and so on. I feel it's too much of an ego trip to tell it. I told it here because I'm out of material and it was requested. But if you're interested, you can read True Hallucinations. I doubt I'll be doing this again very soon, but thank you for your indulgence. Thank you.
Okay.